Welcome back, dear friends. Before we begin, let me know where in the world you are watching, and please don't forget to subscribe and like to support the channel. Your presence here helps these quiet explorations of wisdom reach others seeking understanding in the stillness of evening. Picture, if you will, the southern coast of England in the spring of 1588. The Spanish Armada approaches across dark waters, the greatest invasion fleet the world has ever seen. Rumours race through villages faster than horses can carry them. War is coming. Terror grips the hearts of common folk who know their homes lie in the path of empires at war. In a small parish near Malmesbury, a vicar's wife goes into labour 2 months early, her body responding to the fear that saturates the very air she breathes. The child born that April morning would later write about his own arrival with characteristic bluntness. "Fear and I," he said, "were born twins together." The boy was Thomas Hobbes, and he would grow to become one of the most brilliant, controversial, and misunderstood minds in the history of human thought. His enemies would call him the Monster of Malmesbury. His books would be burned. Both sides of a civil war would despise him. Yet his ideas would change the world more profoundly than almost any philosopher before or since. Tonight, as you prepare for rest, we embark on a journey into the mind of a man who dared to ask the most uncomfortable questions about human nature, about power, about why we live together in societies at all. Hobbes witnessed his world tear itself apart in civil war. He watched a king lose his head on a scaffold. He lived through chaos that made him question everything people believed about government, about morality, about the very foundations of civilization. And from that darkness, he constructed a vision so stark, so unflinching, that it still has the power to disturb us more than 3 centuries after his death. But here's the mystery we'll unravel together as you drift towards sleep. Why would a philosopher who seemed to defend absolute monarchy actually plant the seeds of modern democracy? How could the man who wrote the most authoritarian-sounding political theory in Western philosophy also undermine every traditional justification for political power? And what did he see about human beings that was so terrible he believed only the most powerful authority could save us from ourselves? Settle in. Let your breathing slow. Tonight, we'll discover why Thomas Hobbes described human life without government in words that have echoed through history. We'll understand why he believed we needed what he called a Leviathan, a great artificial monster of our own creation, to protect us from something even more terrifying. And perhaps, as you rest in the safety of your home tonight, doors locked, protected by laws you barely think about, you'll recognize that you're living proof of Hobbes's most controversial claim about what human beings truly need to survive. The story begins not with grand philosophy, but with disgrace and abandonment. Thomas Hobbes's father was a vicar, but not the sort of gentle shepherd of souls you might imagine. Thomas Hobbes Sr. was what people in Elizabethan England called a man of the cloth, only in the most technical sense. He was quick-tempered, uneducated beyond the basics required for his position, and apparently more comfortable with playing cards than with prayer. The biographical details that survive paint a portrait of a man fundamentally unsuited to the pastoral care of human souls. One Saturday night in 1604, after playing cards through the evening and into the early morning hours, the elder Hobbes stumbled into his church for Sunday services still half asleep. In the middle of the service, as parishioners bowed their heads in solemn devotion, the vicar's voice rang out clearly through the stone building. "Trafels is trumps. Clubs are trumps." He had cried out in his sleep, still lost in the card game that had occupied his Saturday night. If that had been the extent of his father's failures, young Thomas might have grown up in relative stability, the son of a merely incompetent clergyman in a small English town. But Thomas Hobbes Sr. had a temper to match his poor judgment. When another local clergyman, Richard Jean, criticised him, or perhaps simply crossed him in some way the details are lost to history, the vicar's response was not prayer or reasoned argument, but violence. In the churchyard itself, in sight of God and congregation, Thomas Hobbes Sr. struck Richard Jean, and then, realising the magnitude of what he had done, fled. He abandoned everything: his position, his home, his reputation, and most significantly, his 3 children. Thomas was 16 years old when his father disappeared from his life forever. The scandal, the whispers, the sudden poverty, the shame of being associated with a man who had brawled at the church door and then run away rather than face consequences, all of this marked young Thomas in ways that would echo through his later philosophy. But young Thomas was fortunate in one respect. His uncle, Francis Hobbes, was a wealthy glover in Malmesbury, a man who had done well in the emerging commercial economy of late Elizabethan England. Francis had no children of his own, and he recognized something in his disgraced brother's son: intelligence, a hunger for learning, a mind that could perhaps transcend the circumstances of birth and scandal. He paid for Thomas's education, first at a small school in Westport, then at a private school where the boy showed remarkable aptitude for languages, and finally, at age 15, at Magdalen Hall in Oxford. Oxford in the early 1600s was still dominated by scholastic philosophy, the elaborate system built over centuries by medieval thinkers who attempted to reconcile Aristotle's ancient wisdom with Christian theology. Students spent years learning to make fine distinctions between different types of causes, different categories of being, different modes of existence. They memorized authorities and learned to cite them in disputes that often seemed to have little connection to the actual world beyond the university walls. Young Thomas Hobbes was brilliant at this game. He mastered Latin and Greek. He could pass arguments and spot logical fallacies. But something in him rebelled against what he was learning. It all felt so empty, so divorced from reality, so useless for understanding the world he actually inhabited. Years later, he would write with barely concealed contempt about the philosophy he'd been taught, calling it little more than insignificant speech, and dismissing whole libraries of medieval thought as exercises in saying nothing with great elaboration. But if Oxford taught him what he didn't believe, it also gave him the tools he would later use to construct his own vision. The logical rigour, the attention to definitions, the systematic approach to questions, all of these he absorbed and would later deploy in service of a radically different kind of philosophy. Upon graduating in 1608, Hobbes entered the service of the Cavendish family, one of the wealthiest and most powerful noble families in England. He was hired as a tutor and companion to William Cavendish, who would later become the second Earl of Devonshire. This position changed everything. Suddenly, the son of a disgraced vicar was living among the aristocracy, travelling in their circles, observing how power actually worked rather than how philosophers said it should work. The Cavendish connection gave Hobbes something else invaluable: the opportunity for the grand tour of Europe. In the early 1600s, wealthy young Englishmen completed their education by travelling through France and Italy, visiting great cities, meeting scholars, seeing art and architecture, that existed nowhere in England. Hobbes accompanied his student on these journeys, and they opened his eyes to a world far larger than provincial England. In Italy, Hobbes met Galileo Galilei, the brilliant scientist who was revolutionizing humanity's understanding of the cosmos. Galileo was using mathematics and observation to overturn beliefs that had stood for thousands of years. He was looking at the world not through the lens of ancient authorities, but through telescopes and careful measurement. He was discovering that the universe operated according to laws, mathematical relationships, mechanical principles that could be understood if one simply looked carefully enough and thought clearly enough. This encounter planted a seed in Hobbes's mind. What if human society could be understood the same way? What if politics and ethics weren't matters of interpreting ancient texts or appealing to divine will, but were instead subject to natural laws that reason could discover? What if you could study human beings the way Galileo studied falling bodies and planetary motion, finding the principles that governed behavior with the same mathematical certainty? Hobbes also traveled in France, where he encountered a very different tradition of thought. French intellectuals were grappling with religious wars that had torn their country apart for decades. They were asking urgent questions about authority, about sovereignty, about what held a society together when people couldn't agree on fundamental questions of faith. These weren't abstract philosophical puzzles, but matters of life and death, questions that determined whether cities burned and whether neighbors slaughtered each other in the streets. Through all these experiences, Hobbes was developing a peculiar way of seeing the world. He noticed the gap between what people said and what they did. He observed that everyone claimed to seek justice and the common good, but somehow this seeking always seemed to align remarkably well with their own interests. He watched aristocrats maneuver for power while speaking of duty. He saw churchmen pursue wealth while preaching poverty. He witnessed scholars defend ideas not because they were true, but because their positions and reputations depended on those ideas being accepted. Hobbes was developing the cold eye of the observer who stands slightly outside the system he studies. The abandoned son of a disgraced father, the scholarship boy among aristocrats, the English scholar in continental courts, he was always positioned to see things others missed because they were too embedded in the structures they inhabited. This outsider's perspective would become one of his greatest philosophical assets. It would allow him to ask questions that seemed obvious once stated, but that most people never thought to ask because the answers seemed too settled, too natural, too much a part of the assumed background of life. What holds society together? Why do people obey laws? What makes one person's commands into legitimate authority rather than mere force? These questions haunted Hobbes as he moved through aristocratic households and travelled across Europe. And they would become urgent, desperately urgent, when everything he knew began to fall apart. Because Hobbes was about to witness something that most people, even most philosophers, only read about in history books. He was about to watch his own country descend into civil war. He was going to see firsthand what happens when the bonds of society break, when the structure that holds people together in peace collapses, when the question of who has the right to rule becomes a question answered not by tradition or law, but by force of arms. And that experience would forge his philosophy in ways that all his European travels and aristocratic observations never could. The boy born of fear was about to have his deepest intuitions about human nature confirmed in the most terrible way possible. By the 1630s, tensions between King Charles I and Parliament had been building for years. The issues were complex, tangled, webs of religious disagreement, constitutional principle, and simple struggles for power. Charles believed in the divine right of kings, the idea that his authority came directly from God and could not be legitimately questioned by mere human institutions. Parliament believed it had ancient rights and privileges that even kings must respect. Charles needed money for wars and governance. Parliament controlled taxation. Neither side was willing to bend. Hobbes watched all of this from his position as tutor and intellectual companion to powerful families with connections at court. He could see the crisis approaching like a storm on the horizon, dark clouds gathering that everyone noticed but few took seriously until the thunder began. By 1640, the situation had deteriorated to the point that thoughtful observers knew some kind of rupture was inevitable. The only questions were when it would come and how terrible it would be. In that year of 1640, Hobbes did something that would embarrass him for the rest of his life, but that also revealed his deepest instincts about political order. He fled. Before actual fighting began, before it was clear that England would descend into full civil war, Hobbes left for Paris. He would later be mocked as the first of all that fled, a philosopher whose theories about courage and fear were rather undermined by his own quick departure at the first sign of danger. But Hobbes was 52 years old, not a young man by the standards of the 17th century. He had no military training, no relevant skills for the conflict that was coming. And he understood something that many of his contemporaries did not yet grasp. Once civil war begins, there is no safe position, no neutral ground. The violence that follows the breakdown of political authority doesn't confine itself to battlefields. It spreads through society like a disease, destroying the innocent along with the guilty, consuming everything in its path. From his exile in Paris, Hobbes watched his country tear itself apart. The reports that reached France painted a picture of escalating horror. Neighbour turned against neighbour. Ancient loyalties dissolved. Men who had served together in peacetime found themselves facing each other across battle lines, each convinced that God and right were on their side. Towns declared for king or parliament, and then were besieged, starved, sometimes sacked. The ordinary business of life, the farming and trading and travelling that allowed people to live, all of it became impossible as armies marched back and forth across England, consuming resources, disrupting markets, turning productive land into battlegrounds. In Paris, Hobbes lived among other royalist exiles, men and women who had fled the conflict, leaving behind estates and positions and lives they had expected to pass on to their children. These were people who had never imagined that their world could collapse. They came from families that had held land for centuries, from positions that seemed as permanent as the stones of England itself. Now they were refugees, dependent on the hospitality of the French court, watching from across the Channel as everything they had known burned. Hobbes used these years in exile to write. In 1642, he published De Cive, which translates as On the Citizen. It was his first systematic treatment of political philosophy, written in Latin for an educated European audience. In this work, Hobbes began to develop the ideas that would later shock England and Europe. He argued that political authority doesn't come from God or from ancient tradition, but from the consent of the governed. He suggested that without government, human life would be unbearable. a condition of constant warfare. And he concluded that only absolute sovereignty could maintain peace. But de Cive was just a preliminary sketch. As the English Civil War ground on, as reports of new battles and atrocities reached Paris, as the initial shock gave way to the grim realization that this conflict would not be resolved quickly, Hobbes worked on something more comprehensive, more systematic, more radical. He was writing Leviathan. Then came January 30th, 1649. King Charles I was led to a scaffold in London. In front of a crowd of thousands, the king who claimed to rule by divine right was executed by his own subjects. His head was severed from his body with a single blow of the axe. The monarchy, the institution that had ruled England for as long as anyone could remember, was abolished. England became a commonwealth, a republic led by Parliament, and increasingly by one man, Oliver Cromwell. For Hobbes, the king's execution must have been a moment of pure horror. Not because he particularly loved Charles, not because he believed in divine right, but because it represented the ultimate failure of political order. The thing that should be impossible, the event that the entire system of government existed to prevent, had happened. The sovereign had been killed by his subjects. The centre had not held. Everything had proven as fragile as Hobbes suspected, but the execution also confirmed something else for Hobbes. It proved that all the traditional justifications for political authority were hollow. If a king could rule by divine right, if his authority came from God, then how could mere humans have the power to execute him? If tradition and ancient custom determined who should rule, how could those same customs be set aside when it became convenient? The old answers no longer worked. A new foundation for politics was needed, one that didn't rely on myths about divine appointment or appeals to ancient precedent that could be interpreted or ignored when pressure came. In Paris, Hobbes had an unusual position. He had fled England before the war began, so he wasn't tainted by participation in the conflict. He had royalist sympathies and connections, which gave him access to the exiled court. But he also had a mind too independent, too philosophical, too committed to following arguments wherever they led, to simply parrot royalist ideology. And this independence gave him something valuable: the freedom to think about politics without being trapped in the partisan categories of either side. During these Paris years, Hobbes took on a prestigious position. He became the mathematics tutor to the young Prince of Wales, the future Charles II, who was living in exile with his mother's court. This connection would later prove valuable when the monarchy was restored. But in the moment, it meant that Hobbes spent time teaching geometry to a teenage prince who would have preferred to be doing almost anything else, trying to convey the beauty of mathematical certainty to a student whose world had been defined by his father's execution and his own powerless exile. Hobbes also had a famous confrontation during these years. René Descartes, the great French philosopher, who was developing his own revolutionary system based on doubt and deduction, published his Meditations on First Philosophy. The work was circulated among major European intellectuals for commentary before publication. Descartes' friend, the scholar Marin Mersenne, sent a copy to Hobbes asking for his objections and criticisms. Hobbes responded with what are now known as the third objections to Descartes' Meditations. They were sharp, probing, and fundamentally at odds with Descartes' entire approach. Where Descartes found certainty in the thinking self, the famous "I think, therefore I am," Hobbes questioned whether thinking required any immaterial substance at all. Where Descartes argued for a sharp distinction between mind and body, Hobbes suggested that everything, including thought, might be explicable in terms of matter and motion. Where Descartes appealed to God as a guarantor of knowledge, Hobbes's arguments seemed to work perfectly well without any such appeal. Descartes was furious. He responded with thinly veiled contempt, dismissing Hobbes's objections and making it clear he wanted nothing more to do with the English philosopher. The two men, perhaps the two most brilliant and original philosophical minds of their generation, never reconciled. They represented fundamentally different visions of how to understand the world, and neither could accept the other's starting point. But these intellectual disputes, fascinating as they were, remained secondary to Hobbes's great project. Throughout his exile, as England experimented with republican government under Cromwell, as the royalist cause seemed more and more hopeless, Hobbes worked on Leviathan. He was constructing a philosophical system that would explain not just why England had fallen into civil war, but why any society is always at risk of such collapse. He was developing a theory of human nature dark enough to account for the atrocities he'd witnessed, yet rational enough to offer hope that human beings could create lasting peace, despite their dangerous inclinations. The book was finished in 1651. Hobbes arranged for its publication in London, not Paris. This decision tells us something important. Leviathan wasn't primarily addressed to royalist exiles or to European intellectuals. It was for England, for a country that had torn itself apart and was now trying to figure out how to live together again. It was a message to all sides of the conflict, an attempt to find foundations for political order that didn't depend on either side being right about the issues that had divided them. What Hobbes offered was something no one expected and almost no one wanted to hear. But it was also something remarkable. A way of thinking about politics that started not with tradition or divine revelation, but with the basics of human psychology, building up from there through careful reasoning to conclusions about what kind of government human beings need to survive. It was philosophy attempting to solve the most urgent, practical problem of its time, the problem of how to prevent societies from destroying themselves. As you rest tonight, imagine Hobbes in his Parisian exile, writing by candlelight, working through the implications of his dark vision of human nature. Outside, the world is at war. His country is torn apart. A king has been executed. Everything that seemed solid has revealed itself to be breakable. And in response, this brilliant, frightened, determined man is constructing a theory that will outlive him by centuries, that will shape how future generations think about power and politics, and the eternal question of how human beings can live together in peace. The stage is now set. We've seen the man and the crisis that formed him. Now we turn to the heart of his philosophy, to his shocking claims about what human beings really are beneath the veneer of civilization. To understand Hobbes's political philosophy, we must first understand his psychology, his theory of what makes human beings tick. And that understanding begins with a radical claim that offended almost everyone who read it. Everything is matter in motion. That's it. The entire universe, including human beings, including human minds, can be understood in terms of physical objects moving according to natural laws. This was not what people in the 17th century wanted to hear. The dominant view, inherited from centuries of Christian philosophy drawing on ancient Greek thought, was that human beings were special. We had immortal souls, immaterial minds that transcended the merely physical world. Our ability to reason, to choose freely, to know truth and pursue goodness, all of this seemed to require something more than just matter pushing against matter. We weren't machines. We weren't just complex animals. We were created in God's image, rational souls inhabiting physical bodies, but not reducible to them. Hobbes rejected all of this. Not out of atheism exactly, though many accused him of it, but out of his
conviction that philosophy must build on the same foundations as the new science he'd encountered in Galileo and others. If we want to understand the world, we should look at what we can actually observe, not at what ancient authorities tell us must be true. And what we observe, Hobbes argued, is matter and motion. Consider what happens when you see something. Light, which is matter in motion, strikes an object. That creates more motion that travels to your eye. This motion affects the organs of sight, which are themselves just complex arrangements of matter. The motion is transmitted through nerves, which are physical structures, to the brain, which is a physical organ. All of this is just matter moving according to physical laws. Where in this process do we need to invoke an immaterial soul? Where does the physical chain of causation require something non-physical to intervene? Hobbes pushed this analysis to its radical conclusion. Sensations are just motions in our bodies caused by external objects. Thoughts are patterns of these motions. Imagination is what happens when the motions continue, even after the external stimulus is gone, like ripples continuing in water after the stone that caused them has sunk. Memory is just persistence of these internal motions, fading over time as all motions naturally dissipate unless renewed. Even reasoning, that ability that philosophers had always held up as evidence of humanity's special status, even reasoning could be understood mechanistically. Reasoning, Hobbes suggested, is really just a kind of computation. We add and subtract concepts the way we add and subtract numbers. When we reason that all humans are mortal, Socrates is human, therefore Socrates is mortal. We're really just performing operations on definitions. It's calculation, not mystical access to transcendent truth. This philosophical move, reducing everything to matter in motion, allowed Hobbes to claim he was doing something that philosophy had never successfully done before. He was putting the study of human nature on a scientific foundation, making it as rigorous as geometry, as demonstrable as physics. Whether he succeeded is debatable, but the ambition itself was revolutionary, and it shaped everything that followed in his political philosophy. Now, if humans are just complex physical systems, what drives human behavior? Hobbes's answer was startlingly simple: appetite and aversion. We're attracted to some things and repelled by others. We move toward what we desire and away from what we fear. That's the basic mechanism underlying all human action. But notice what's missing from this account. There's no built-in purpose, no natural end toward which human beings should aim. For Aristotle and the whole tradition of philosophy, Hobbes was rejecting. Everything in nature had a telos, a goal, a proper function. Humans were naturally aimed at happiness, at the good life, at flourishing in communities. And the virtuous person was someone who developed their nature properly, who actualized the potential built into human beings by nature or by God. Hobbes dismissed all of this. There is no final goal of human life, no ultimate satisfaction, no point at which we can say, I have achieved my purpose and can now rest. Instead, there is only what Hobbes called felicity, which he defined as continual progress of the desire from one object to another. We get one thing we want, and immediately we want something else. We achieve one goal, and that achievement becomes the basis for setting a new goal. Desire is endless. Satisfaction is always temporary. Rest is impossible until death. Think about this for a moment. In your own life, have you ever reached a point where you wanted nothing more? Where you were completely satisfied and could imagine wanting nothing that you didn't already have? Perhaps for brief moments, but not as a stable condition. Achieving one thing opens up new possibilities, new desires, new goals. The person who gets the job they wanted starts wanting promotion. The person who buys the house starts thinking about renovation. The person who achieves fame starts worrying about maintaining it. We are, as Hobbes saw us, creatures of perpetual striving. But if desire is endless, if satisfaction is always temporary, then we need a constant supply of the things we desire. We need not just food for today, but the assurance of food tomorrow. Not just safety in this moment, but reliable security over time. Not just current satisfaction, but the means to future satisfaction. And that's where power comes in. Hobbes defined power as present means to obtain some future apparent good. Power is what enables us to satisfy future desires. Money is power because it can be exchanged for things we'll want. Strength is power because it lets us take or defend things. Intelligence is power because it helps us achieve goals. Friends are power because they can help us. Reputation is power because it makes others more likely to cooperate with us. And here Hobbes made the observation that would become one of his most famous and most disturbing lines. I put for a general inclination of all mankind a perpetual and restless desire of power after power that ceaseth only in death. Read that again slowly. Not some people, not the ambitious or the greedy, but all of mankind, a perpetual and restless desire for power, after power, more and more, never enough, ceasing only in death. This sounds like a condemnation of human greed, but Hobbes didn't mean it that way. He wasn't making a moral judgment. He was making what he thought was a simple observation about the logic of the human situation. If you can never be finally satisfied, if desire is endless, then you can never have enough power, because you can never be certain that your current power will be sufficient for all your future needs. The person who has a lot today might face unexpected challenges tomorrow. The person who is strong now will
Grow old and weak. The person with many friends today might find them gone when crisis comes. So the rational response is always to seek more power, more security, more assurance of future satisfaction. Not because we're evil, but because we're mortal, vulnerable, future-oriented beings who can never know for certain what we'll need or want tomorrow. The desire for power is just the flip side of perpetual desire itself, combined with the rational recognition of our own vulnerability. Now we get to what Hobbes identified as the three principal causes of conflict among human beings. He was very systematic about this, laying out three distinct sources of quarrel built into human nature itself. First, competition. When two people desire the same thing, and that thing cannot be shared or divided, they become enemies. This is simple scarcity. If there's only one piece of food and two hungry people, they will compete for it. If there's one position of power and two ambitious people, they will struggle for it. Competition is the most obvious source of conflict, the one that anyone can recognize. Second,
diffidence. Hobbes's word for what we might call distrust or insecurity. Even if there's no immediate competition over resources, people have reason to fear each other. If I have something valuable, I must worry that you might try to take it. If I'm not trying to harm you, I can't be sure you're not trying to harm me. And knowing that you're probably worried about me, I have even more reason to worry about you. This creates what we now call a security dilemma. Everyone takes defensive measures to protect themselves, but these defensive measures look like threats to others, who then take their own defensive measures, which look like threats to me, and so on. Distrust breeds more distrust in a self-reinforcing cycle. Third, glory. This one is more subtle. Even if there's no immediate competition, and even if we've somehow established security, people still compete for reputation, for status, for recognition. Hobbes observed that people will fight over insults, over perceived disrespect, over what he called trifles, like a word, a smile, a different opinion. Why? Because reputation is itself a form of power. If others think you're weak or foolish or contemptible, they're more likely to try to dominate you. If they fear or respect you, they're more likely to leave you alone or cooperate on your terms. So maintaining reputation becomes a constant struggle, and people will take enormous risks to avoid being disrespected. These three causes of quarrel aren't separate problems. They interact and reinforce each other. Competition makes people distrust each other. Distrust makes people try to dominate each other before being dominated. The struggle for dominance becomes entangled with glory and reputation. And all of it flows from the basic situation of beings with endless desires, limited resources, and the ability to harm each other. Which brings us to what Hobbes called the equality of ability among human beings. This is one of his most important and most easily misunderstood points. He wasn't claiming that all people are equally strong or equally intelligent. Obviously, some people are stronger, some smarter, some more skilled. What Hobbes meant was something more specific and more frightening. All human beings are equal in their ability to threaten each other's lives. The weakest, Hobbes wrote, has strength enough to kill the strongest, either by secret machination or by confederacy with others. Even the strongest man must sleep. Even the most powerful person can be poisoned, ambushed, or ganged up on. Physical superiority doesn't guarantee safety. Intelligence doesn't make you immune to violence. No individual human being is so superior to all others that they can simply disregard the threat everyone else poses. This equality in vulnerability is what makes human relationships so dangerous. If some people were genuinely invulnerable, like gods walking among mortals, then they could simply impose order, and the rest of us would have no choice but to submit. But that's not our situation. We're all vulnerable. We can all threaten each other. And that equality of ability to threaten means that no one is safe unless there's something beyond individual strength maintaining order. As you lie in darkness tonight, breathing slowly, feeling yourself sink into rest, consider how perfectly Hobbes had captured something about the human condition. We are creatures of endless desire and limited power, competing for scarce goods, unable to trust each other, constantly worried about reputation and status, and all of it taking place among beings equal enough in their ability to harm that no one can ever be truly safe based on their own strength alone. That's the foundation. That's Hobbes's psychology in its stark essentials. Matter in motion, producing endless desire, producing perpetual competition, producing equal vulnerability. Now we can turn to his famous thought experiment, to the question he posed that has haunted political philosophy ever since. What would happen if there were no government at all? Hobbes asked his readers to imagine something most of them had never experienced: life without government. Not the temporary absence of a king when a new one is being chosen, not the breakdown of order in one region while other regions remain stable, but a condition in which there is no political authority at all, no laws backed by force, no one with the power to enforce agreements or punish wrongdoing. He called this hypothetical condition the state of nature, and he insisted it wasn't just a historical claim about how humans once lived before civilization. It was a thought experiment, a way of asking what human life would be like if you stripped away all the structures of law and authority we take for granted. What's left when you remove government? What are humans like without the artificial order that
Political authority creates? This was a brilliant philosophical move. Rather than arguing about which form of government is best or which laws are most just, Hobbes was asking a more fundamental question. Why do we need government at all? What problem does political authority solve? And the answer to that question, he argued, would show us what government must be like if it's going to solve the problem it exists to address. So, let's follow Hobbes's reasoning step by step, building the argument the way he did, watching how each piece follows from the last with a kind of terrible logic. We start with the psychology we've already established. Humans have endless desires. We seek power after power. We compete for scarce resources. We distrust each other. We fight over glory and reputation. And we're all equal enough in our ability to harm each other that no one is naturally safe. Now imagine that situation without any authority to enforce rules, without any laws that actually constrain behavior, without any punishment for violence or theft or breach of contract. What would rational people do in that situation? Hobbes's answer was chilling. Each person would pursue their own interests as best they could. And given the three causes of quarrel, given the equality of ability, given the absence of any authority to enforce agreements, the result would be inevitable: war. Not necessarily constant fighting every moment, but a condition in which everyone is ready to fight, where violence is always an option, where there's no security, no ability to plan for the future, no basis for trust. Think carefully about why this follows. If there's no authority to punish theft, then taking what I want by force becomes a rational strategy whenever I'm strong enough to do it. But that means you can't trust me not to take your things. So you need to take defensive measures, which means gathering your own power, maybe even attacking me before I can attack you. But now I see you gathering power and I have to worry that you're about to attack, so I need to attack first. Or maybe I just need to attack to take your resources before you can use them against me. The logic pushes toward constant conflict. What about agreements? In the state of nature, couldn't people just agree to cooperate, to respect each other's property, to not harm each other? The problem is that without an authority to enforce agreements, there's no guarantee anyone will keep their word. If I agree not to harm you, and you agree not to harm me, but then you see an opportunity to benefit by breaking that agreement, what's to stop you? Your conscience? Your sense of honor? Perhaps. But can I rely on that? Can I stake my life on your virtue when breaking the agreement might save your life or make you rich? And knowing that you're thinking the same way about me,
Knowing that you can't fully trust me to keep my word, why wouldn't you break the agreement first when it's convenient? The rational thing, in the absence of enforcement, is to break agreements whenever keeping them becomes costly and you think you can get away with it. But that means no agreements can be trusted, which means no cooperation is possible, which means everyone is thrown back on their own strength and cunning to survive. Hobbes anticipated that many readers would find this argument exaggerated. Surely people aren't that bad. Surely we're capable of cooperation without some powerful authority forcing us to behave. So he offered an empirical test, a way to check his reasoning against actual behavior. "Do you lock your doors when you go to sleep at night?" he asked. "When you travel, do you arm yourself or travel in groups?" Of course you do. Even though you live under a government, even though there are laws against theft and assault, even though there are police you can call, you still take these precautions. Why? Because you don't fully trust your neighbors. You know that even with law and authority present, there's some risk of violence or theft. You act as if others might harm you if they had the opportunity. Now, if you can't fully trust your neighbors, even with police and courts and prisons backing up the law, imagine how much worse it would be if there were no law at all, no police, no courts, no consequences for violence. If you lock your doors even when theft is illegal and punishable, what would you do if theft were neither? The precautions you take under government suggest how dangerous the state of nature would be without it. Hobbes also pointed to actual historical examples. When civil wars break out, when government breaks down, what happens? "We've seen it," he said. "We've watched England tear itself apart. And what we observe is exactly what the theory predicts. Neighbor turns against neighbor, violence becomes endemic, property becomes insecure, normal economic life becomes impossible. Civil war is a glimpse into the state of nature, a momentary return to the condition that exists when political authority fails." And then we come to the passage that has echoed through centuries, the words that appear in every introduction to political philosophy, the description that remains shocking even now when we've heard it so many times, "It's become familiar. In such condition there is no place for industry because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, no navigation, nor use of the commodities that may be imported by sea, no commodious building, no instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short." Let those words settle into your consciousness as you rest. Solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Why no industry? Because if you can't be sure you'll reap what you sow, why plant? If someone stronger might just take the crops you've grown, why bother growing them? Without security of property, without some guarantee that your labor will benefit you rather than whoever can take it by force, there's no incentive to produce anything beyond immediate consumption. Why no navigation or trade? Because you can't trust agreements with strangers. You can't enter into contracts that will be honored. You can't send goods on a ship and trust they'll be paid for on the other end. Trade requires trust, and trust requires enforcement, and enforcement requires authority. Why no building, no tools, no technology? Because all of these things require sustained effort over time, cooperation among many people, division of labor, specialization. You need to be able to plan for the future, to invest current effort in things that will pay off later. But in a condition of constant insecurity, where violence is always imminent, you can't plan. You can only react, defend, survive from moment to moment. Why no knowledge, no arts, no letters? Because these refined activities require leisure, security, institutions that preserve and transmit learning over generations. A person constantly worried about violent death has no time for philosophy or poetry. A society that cannot maintain order, cannot maintain universities or libraries, or any of the infrastructure that makes intellectual and artistic life possible. And notice Hobbes's phrase, no society. In the state of nature, there aren't even stable social relationships. You can't have families that last, communities that endure, friendships that transcend immediate advantage. Everything is provisional, temporary, always ready to dissolve when interests diverge. The word solitary is key. We are, each of us, alone in the state of nature, unable to form genuine bonds with others because we can never fully trust them and they can never fully trust us. This is Hobbes's vision of freedom without government, of the natural condition of humankind when stripped of political authority. And it's important to understand what he's not saying. He's not saying that human beings are naturally evil. He's not claiming that we enjoy violence or take pleasure in others' suffering. Some people might, but that's not necessary for his argument. What Hobbes is saying is that the situation itself, the structure of interaction among beings with our characteristics, necessarily produces conflict. Put self-interested creatures with endless desires and limited power together in a condition where there's no authority to enforce rules, and they will come into conflict regardless of whether they're virtuous or vicious. The problem isn't human nature in a moral sense. The problem is the logic of the situation. This is actually a strange kind of optimism buried within the pessimism. If the problem is structural rather than moral, then changing the structure can solve the problem without requiring people to become better than they are. We don't need saints to have peace. We just need the right institutions. But before we get to the solution, let's sit with the problem a moment longer. Hobbes has shown us, or tried to show us, that total freedom is total insecurity. That natural liberty, the right to do whatever we think necessary for our survival, becomes the right to nothing because everyone else has the same right and will exercise it against us. That equality of power among vulnerable beings creates not mutual respect, but mutual threat. The state of nature is Hobbes's answer to anyone who romanticizes the past, who imagines that humans were once free and happy before governments constrained them. He's also answering anyone who thinks we could just dispense with political authority and live by voluntary cooperation alone. The state of nature is what happens when there's no Leviathan, no common power to keep everyone in awe, and it's unbearable. As you sink deeper into rest tonight, protected by walls and locks and laws you barely think about, consider how radical Hobbes's insight was. He saw that the freedom to do anything is the freedom to be secure in nothing. He understood that rights without enforcement are just words. He grasped that the absence of authority doesn't produce liberty, but chaos. And from that dark vision, he was going to construct an argument for political obligation that would change how we think about government forever. But that comes next. For now, rest with the problem clearly in view. Humans, as Hobbes described them, rational enough to see what they need, but not powerful enough to secure it alone, social enough to benefit from cooperation, but self-interested enough to betray it. equal enough to threaten each other, but not equal enough to trust. In the state of nature, there is no peace, only fear, only insecurity, only the grim struggle for survival that consumes everything human beings might otherwise be or create. And the question that will occupy us next is this: how do we escape? What could possibly convince rational, self-interested people to give up their natural liberty and accept constraints on their behavior? What kind of authority could maintain peace among beings so dangerous to each other? Hobbes has shown us the disease. Now we'll examine his cure, which many have found as disturbing as the disease itself.
Hobbes has painted a grim picture. Life in the state of nature is unbearable, a condition of constant fear and insecurity that makes everything we value about human existence impossible. But here's the remarkable thing. Hobbes believed that human reason itself could show us the way out. The same rational capacity that lets us see how terrible the state of nature would be also shows us how to escape it. He called these rational principles the laws of nature, though it's crucial to understand what he meant by that phrase. These aren't laws in the sense of commands issued by a lawgiver. They're not moral obligations in any traditional sense. They're what Hobbes called theorems, or precepts of reason, rational conclusions about what conduces to self-preservation. They're discovered by thinking clearly about what rational self-interest requires in the human situation. The first law of nature is the most fundamental. Seek peace, if you have hope of obtaining it. If you can't obtain peace, then you may use all the advantages of war to defend yourself. This makes perfect sense once you understand the state of nature. War is terrible, as we've seen. It makes all human achievement impossible. So if there's any way to secure peace, any possibility of escaping the state of nature's violence, reason tells us to pursue it. But reason also tells us not to be naive. If others aren't willing to pursue peace, if we're stuck in the state of nature whether we like it or not, then we need to do whatever it takes to survive. The second law of nature follows from the first. Be willing to lay down your right to all things when others are willing to do the same, to the degree necessary for peace. This is the key move, the beginning of the escape from natural liberty into civil society. In the state of nature, everyone has a right to everything. I have a right to take your food if I need it to survive. You have a right to kill me if you perceive me as a threat. These unlimited rights make peace impossible because my exercising my rights threatens you, and your exercising your rights threatens me. But what if we could make a deal? What if I agreed to give up my unlimited right to harm you, and you agreed to give up your unlimited right to harm me? Then we'd both be safer. We'd both gain security by mutually limiting our freedom. The second law of nature tells us that this trade is rational, that giving up dangerous liberties in exchange for security is the smart move, as long as, and this is crucial, others are making the same trade. Notice that qualification, when others are willing to do the same. This isn't naive pacifism. Hobbes isn't saying you should unilaterally disarm, should give up your rights while others keep theirs. That would be suicide, not wisdom. The law of nature tells you to lay down your rights only when doing so is mutual, when everyone is giving up the same dangerous freedoms together. It's a collective solution to a collective problem. Third law of nature makes this even clearer. Keep covenants that you've made. A covenant is an agreement to do something in the future. I promise to deliver goods next week.
You promise to pay when you receive them. This kind of agreement is essential for cooperation. But as we've seen, in the state of nature, covenants are just words. There's no guarantee anyone will keep their promise when the time comes. Hobbes saw this as the fundamental problem. Even if people rationally understand that mutual cooperation would benefit everyone, even if they're willing in principle to constrain their behavior for mutual advantage, they can't trust each other to actually follow through. And without trust, no cooperation is possible. Each person knows that if they keep their promise while others break theirs, they'll be exploited. So the rational thing seems to be to break promises whenever convenient. But if everyone reasons that way, no promises are credible, and we're stuck in the state of nature, despite everyone being worse off for it. This is what we now call a collective action problem, or a prisoner's dilemma. Everyone can see that cooperation would benefit all, but individual rationality pushes toward defection, toward breaking agreements. And because everyone knows everyone else is tempted to defect, no one trusts the agreements, and cooperation collapses before it begins. Hobbes's solution to this problem is both brilliant and disturbing. If the difficulty is that agreements aren't trustworthy because there's no enforcement, then create an enforcement mechanism. If the problem is that everyone is tempted to break covenants when convenient, then create a power that makes breaking covenants inconvenient. Make someone or some group strong enough to punish covenant breakers so effectively that keeping promises becomes the rational choice even for selfish people. This is where the social contract comes in, though it's important to understand that Hobbes's version is quite different from what many later philosophers would develop. The contract isn't between rulers and ruled. It's not an agreement where the sovereign promises to rule well in exchange for obedience. That kind of mutual contract would just recreate the problem at a higher level, because who would enforce the contract between sovereign and subjects? No, Hobbes's social contract is an agreement among the people themselves. Each person, reasoning about how to escape the state of nature, comes to the same conclusion. We need a common power to enforce agreements and maintain peace. So, each person agrees with all the others to authorize some person or assembly to make decisions for all of them, to judge disputes, to command and forbid. Each person says, in effect, I authorize this person or group to act on my behalf, and I recognize their decisions as if they were my own decisions. Hobbes gave this idea vivid expression. Imagine each person saying to all the others, I authorize and give up my right of governing myself to this man or to this assembly of men on this condition that you give up your right to him and authorize all his actions in like manner. What this creates is an artificial person, a unified entity made up of the authorizations of all the individuals who compose it. Hobbes called this artificial person the Leviathan, or the Commonwealth, or simply the Sovereign. It's artificial because it doesn't exist naturally, but is created by human agreement. It's a person because it acts as a unity, making decisions, issuing commands, enforcing rules. And it's sovereign because there is no higher authority that judges or constrains it. This sovereign power, once created, has to be absolute. And here's where Hobbes's argument becomes uncomfortable for almost everyone who reads it. He insisted that the sovereign cannot be limited, cannot be divided, cannot be held accountable by the subjects who created it. Why? Because any limitation on sovereign power recreates the state of nature at some level. Think about it this way. Suppose we say the sovereign can rule
but only within certain limits, only on certain topics, only in ways that respect certain rights. Who decides whether the sovereign has exceeded those limits? If individual subjects can decide for themselves when the sovereign has overstepped, then we're back to everyone being their own judge, which is just the state of nature again. Each person deciding what the law allows is no different from no law at all. What if we say there should be another authority that checks the sovereign, some other body that can veto or override the sovereign's decisions? Then that checking authority is the real sovereign, and the same problem arises at that level. Either authority is divided, in which case we have potential conflict between authorities and no clear answer to who wins, or authority is unified in whoever has the final say. You can't escape the logic. Either someone or some body has ultimate final authority, or you don't really have authority at all. Hobbes worked through various attempts to limit or divide sovereignty and showed why each fails. Separation of powers. Then the different powers can come into conflict with no way to resolve the dispute except by force, which is civil war. Constitutional limits. Who enforces them when the sovereign violates them? Another authority. Then that's the real sovereign. The subjects themselves. Then each subject is judge in their own case, and we're back to the state of nature. Rights that subjects retain against the sovereign. Rights without enforcement are meaningless, as we've seen. And if subjects can enforce their rights against the sovereign, then the sovereign isn't really sovereign. The only right Hobbes recognized that subjects never give up is the right of self-preservation. If the sovereign commands you to kill yourself or refuses to defend you against immediate threats, you can resist because the whole point of creating
The sovereign was to secure your life. But beyond that narrow exception, the sovereign's authority must be unlimited if it's to do the job it was created to do. The implications are stark. The sovereign defines what is just and unjust, right and wrong, legal and illegal. Not because the sovereign is necessarily wise or good, but because that's what sovereignty means. Having an authority means having someone whose word on these matters is final. The sovereign can't commit injustice in the legal sense because justice is defined by the sovereign's commands. Religious authority must be subordinate to political authority. This was especially controversial in Hobbes's time, when religious disputes were tearing Europe apart. But Hobbes was adamant. The sovereign must have the power to determine religious practices, to settle religious disputes, to prevent religious disagreement from destroying civil peace. The alternative is to have multiple authorities claiming ultimate allegiance, which inevitably produces conflict. Subjects generally cannot rebel against the sovereign. This might seem to contradict everything about social contract theory, which we associate with ideas about consent of the governed and right of revolution. But Hobbes's logic is clear. If subjects could legitimately rebel whenever they thought the sovereign was governing badly, then the sovereign wouldn't really have authority. The subjects would be judging the sovereign, which makes them the real authority, which recreates the state of nature. As you rest tonight, feel the tension in Hobbes's position. On one hand, he's given us a strangely democratic foundation for politics. All authority comes from the consent of the governed. The sovereign is created by agreement among equals. There's no divine right, no natural hierarchy, no appeal to tradition. Political authority is artificial, conventional, created by human beings for human purposes. That's radically modern,
even revolutionary. On the other hand, the conclusion seems authoritarian, even tyrannical. Absolute power with no accountability, no right to rebel except in extreme circumstances, no check on the sovereign beyond the sovereign's own judgment. How can these two aspects fit together? How can democratic premises lead to authoritarian conclusions? The answer lies in Hobbes's unflinching focus on the problem he's trying to solve. The problem is civil war, is breakdown of order, is the constant threat that society will slide back into the state of nature. Everything Hobbes argues for is designed to prevent that catastrophe. The sovereign must be absolute because anything less than absolute leaves room for the conflicts that destroy peace. The subjects cannot rebel because allowing rebellion recreates the very problem government was meant to solve. Whether you find this convincing likely depends on how seriously you take the threat Hobbes was addressing. If you've lived through civil war, if you've watched society collapse, if
you've experienced the breakdown of order firsthand, Hobbes's willingness to accept almost any government rather than risk returning to chaos might seem reasonable. If you've been fortunate enough to live under stable government most of your life, his arguments for absolute sovereignty might seem like the cure being worse than the disease. But either way, Hobbes has transformed the question. He's forced us to confront the foundations of political obligation, to ask why we should obey government at all, to recognize that the alternative to authority isn't freedom, but chaos. And he's done it without appealing to God or tradition or nature in any traditional sense. He's built a theory of politics on the minimal foundations of rational self-interest and mutual agreement. That achievement alone makes him one of the pivotal figures in political thought. The escape from the state of nature requires creating a Leviathan, an artificial monster of our own making, powerful enough to keep us in awe, to make us keep our covenants, to maintain the peace without which human life remains solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. It's not a comfortable solution. But Hobbes never promised comfort. He promised security, order, the possibility of civilization. Whether the price he demanded was worth paying remains one of the great questions in political philosophy. In 1651, while England was still trying to figure out how to govern itself after executing its king, while Oliver Cromwell was consolidating power as Lord Protector, while royalists in exile still hoped for restoration of the monarchy, Thomas Hobbes published a book with an audacious title, Leviathan, or The Matter, Form and Power of a Commonwealth Ecclesiastical and Civil. The title itself was provocative. Leviathan appears in the Bible as a terrifying sea monster, a creature of chaos that only God can tame. In the book of Job, God describes the Leviathan to humble Job, to remind him of powers beyond human comprehension or control. It was an image of primordial danger, of forces that threatened to overwhelm human order. But Hobbes transformed the Leviathan into something else entirely. Look at the famous frontispiece of the book, the illustration that appeared on early editions. You see a giant crowned figure rising above a landscape, towering over cities and countryside. The figure holds a sword in one hand and a bishop's crozier in the other, symbolizing both civil and ecclesiastical authority. But look closer at the giant's body. It's not solid. It's composed of hundreds of tiny human figures, all facing the crowned head, all part of the larger whole. This is Hobbes's Leviathan. Not a natural monster, but an artificial one,
not chaos but order. The multitude of individuals unified into a single corporate body through their mutual covenant. The sovereign as the authorized representative of all, wielding power not against the people but as the people, or at least as the artificial person created by
their agreement. The monster is us, or rather, it's what we become when we successfully escape the state of nature by creating common power. The book itself was a masterpiece of systematic thinking, laying out Hobbes's entire philosophy from his materialism through human psychology, to the state of nature, to the social contract, to the powers of the sovereign, to the relationship between church and state, to the nature of Christian commonwealth. It was comprehensive, rigorous, and written in English prose that was alternately elegant and brutally direct. This last point mattered enormously. Hobbes's earlier work, Descartes, had been written in Latin for an educated European audience. Leviathan was written in English, for English readers, in language that, while sophisticated, was accessible to anyone with basic literacy. Hobbes wanted his ideas to reach not just scholars, but parliamentarians, merchants, anyone involved in the political life of his country. He was intervening in a live political crisis, not just engaging in academic philosophy. And intervene he did, though probably not in the way he intended. Leviathan offended almost everyone. Royalists were horrified by Hobbes's denial of divine right. If the king's authority comes from the people's consent rather than from God, if sovereignty is conventional rather than natural, then what makes monarchy special? Why should Charles II be restored rather than some other form of government being chosen? Hobbes had provided a rational argument for absolute sovereignty, but he'd undermined the traditional foundations of monarchical legitimacy in the process. Republicans and parliamentarians were equally horrified, but for different reasons. Hobbes had argued for absolute, undivided sovereignty. No separation of powers, no right of resistance, no accountability of rulers to ruled beyond the narrow case of self-preservation. This seemed to justify tyranny, to leave subjects helpless before arbitrary power. Even if you accepted that some government was necessary, why this government? Why absolute monarchy rather than limited government with checks and balances? And then there were the churches. Hobbes had subordinated all religious authority to the sovereign. He'd argued that the sovereign must determine religious practices, settle theological disputes, control church offices and doctrines. This seemed to make religion merely a tool of political power, to deny any independent authority to spiritual matters. Both Anglicans and Puritans, Catholics and Protestants, found things in Leviathan to offend them. Hobbes seemed to be reducing faith to a matter of civil obedience. Worse, there were passages in Leviathan that could be read as questioning fundamental Christian doctrines. Hobbes's materialism seemed to leave no room for immaterial souls or life after death in any traditional sense. His account of Scripture emphasized natural explanations and questioned supernatural claims, while Hobbes insisted he was a Christian and argued for the compatibility of his philosophy with Christianity. Many readers suspected atheism lurking beneath his professions of faith. The book was condemned, banned, burned in effigy at Oxford University. Hobbes was accused of heresy, atheism, corrupting youth, undermining morality. For years after publication, attacks on Hobbes and Hobbism became a minor industry among English writers. To call someone a Hobbist was to accuse them of denying God, morality, and decency itself. Yet despite all this hostility, or perhaps because of it,
Leviathan became one of the most discussed and influential books of its age. You couldn't talk about politics in 17th century England without addressing Hobbes's arguments. You might reject his conclusions, but you had to engage with his framework. He had changed the terms of debate in ways that couldn't be undone. Interestingly, while royalists disliked Hobbes's foundations, they appreciated his conclusions about absolute sovereignty. And while Republicans hated his defense of absolutism, some found his social contract framework useful for quite different purposes. The book was too systematic, too powerful, too thorough to be simply dismissed. It had to be argued with, which meant its categories and questions became the common property of political thought. Hobbes returned to England in 1651, the same year Leviathan was published. This was a risky move. The country was still unsettled, his book was making enemies, and his royalist connections were well known. But perhaps Hobbes calculated that Cromwell's regime, which had its own problems with legitimacy and needed philosophical support, might tolerate him. Or perhaps he simply wanted to come home. He spent the Commonwealth years mostly quiet, writing but not publishing on controversial topics, meeting with intellectuals, enjoying whatever protection his former students' affection provided. When Charles II was restored to the throne in 1660, Hobbes might have expected favour. After all, he'd been the king's mathematics tutor during exile. He'd written a defence of absolute monarchy, even if the foundation for that defence was unconventional. Charles did grant Hobbes a pension and received him at court. But the king also made clear that Hobbes must not publish anything more on politics or religion. Too many powerful people wanted Hobbes silenced. The churches, the universities, Parliament, all saw him as dangerous. Charles protected Hobbes from worse persecution, but that protection came with restrictions. The most brilliant political philosopher in England was forbidden to publish philosophy. Imagine the frustration. Hobbes had more to say, more arguments to make, responses to critics to publish. He'd spent years developing his system, and now he was told to be quiet. He did write more, including Behemoth, a history of the English Civil War that applied his political philosophy to recent events, but it couldn't be published during his
lifetime. His ideas would have to wait for future generations to be fully heard. The irony is rich. Hobbes wrote Leviathan to prevent civil war, to provide a rational foundation for stable government, to show why absolute sovereignty was necessary for peace. The book succeeded in changing how people thought about politics, but it also made its author too dangerous to be fully heard. The Monster of Malmesbury had created a monster of a book, and both were too threatening to be tolerated by the authorities whose power they theoretically defended. As you drift towards sleep tonight, consider how ideas can be more dangerous than armies. Hobbes never led soldiers or held political office. He was a scholar, a tutor, a writer. Yet his arguments threatened kings and churches, changed political discourse, influenced generations of thinkers. The Leviathan he described, that artificial person created by social contract, was matched by another creation, the book itself, an artifact of thought that lived on beyond its author's control, generating controversy and insight in equal measure. The ideas Hobbes published in 1651 are still with us. We still argue about the foundations of political obligation, about the balance between security and liberty, about what legitimates government authority. The terms have changed, the conclusions we draw may differ from Hobbes's, but the questions he forced us to confront remain alive. That's the real power of Leviathan, not its specific doctrines, but its transformation of how we think about politics itself.
A generation after Hobbes published Leviathan, another English philosopher took up the same questions but reached strikingly different conclusions. John Locke, writing in the 1680s during another period of political crisis in England, accepted much of Hobbes's framework while rejecting his absolutist conclusions. The result was a vision of politics that would prove even more influential than Hobbes's, especially in the emerging liberal tradition that would shape modern democracy. Locke's second treatise of government, published in 1689, begins with the state of nature, just as Hobbes did. This wasn't coincidence. By Locke's time, the social contract framework Hobbes had developed had become the standard way of thinking about political legitimacy. If you wanted to argue about politics, you started with the state of nature and built up from there. Hobbes had set the terms of debate so effectively that even his critics had to work within the structure he'd created. But Locke's state of nature was fundamentally different from Hobbes's vision of war and chaos. For Locke, the state of nature was a condition of perfect freedom and equality, but it wasn't necessarily violent or anarchic. It was, Locke argued, governed by the law of nature, which could be known by reason, and that law of nature taught clear moral principles. No one ought to harm another in their life, health, liberty, or possessions. This makes an enormous
difference. For Hobbes, there were no moral constraints in the state of nature, no genuine right and wrong beyond what conduces to self-preservation. Rights were just liberties, permissions to do whatever you thought necessary. For Locke, the state of nature already contained moral law. People already had genuine rights to life, liberty, and property, rights that existed before any government and that government must respect. Where did these natural rights come from? Locke's answer was theological. God created human beings and gave them the world to use. We have a right to self-preservation because we're God's property, and it would be wrong to destroy what belongs to God. We have property rights because we mix our labor with natural resources, and our labor is our own, so what we create through labor becomes ours. The moral structure of reality, grounded in divine creation, gives content to natural law and natural rights. Now, if the state of nature already has moral law and natural rights, why do we need government? Locke's answer was more modest than Hobbes's. We need government not because the state of nature is unbearable, but because it has inconveniences. Without a common authority, disputes about rights are hard to resolve. Everyone is judge in their own case, which leads to bias. Enforcement of natural law is uncertain. Some people will violate others' rights, and while those people can be punished, there's no systematic, reliable mechanism for doing so. So people form civil society through consent to create institutions that will protect their natural rights more effectively. Notice what's different here. For Hobbes, government creates order where there was only chaos. For Locke, government protects rights that already exist. For Hobbes, the sovereign defines justice. For Locke, justice is independent of government, and government is legitimate only insofar as it respects natural justice. This leads to radically different conclusions about political authority. Locke agreed that government requires sovereignty, but his sovereign is limited in ways Hobbes never allowed. Government's power extends only to protecting natural rights. It has no authority to violate those rights, no matter how expedient it might seem. The power to make laws is limited by the requirement that those laws serve the public good and respect individual rights.
Moreover, political power can be divided. Locke distinguished between legislative, executive, and what he called federative powers, the power to conduct foreign relations. These could be held by different bodies or persons creating checks and balances. This division of powers wouldn't recreate the state of nature as Hobbes feared, because all the powers remain bound by natural law and by their common purpose of protecting rights. Most dramatically, Locke argued that people retain the right to revolution. If government systematically violates the rights it's supposed to protect, if it acts against the
public good, if it becomes tyrannical, then the people can dissolve it and create new government. The social contract isn't irrevocable, as Hobbes insisted. It's conditional on government doing its job. And when government fails badly enough, the contract is broken and people return to their natural liberty to form new political arrangements. This was explosive stuff in the context of 17th century England. Locke was writing around the time of the Glorious Revolution, when Parliament invited William of Orange to take the throne from James II. His second treatise was essentially a justification for that revolution, an argument that deposing a king could be legitimate if that king violated his trust. Where Hobbes seemed to justify any government that could maintain order, Locke provided a philosophical foundation for limited government and justified resistance. Yet notice how much Locke accepted from Hobbes: the framework of state of nature and social contract, the idea that political authority requires justification in terms of the people's consent, the rejection of divine right, and appeals to tradition as sufficient grounds for obedience. These were all Hobbesian moves, and Locke couldn't have made his argument without them. Locke was working within the intellectual space Hobbes had created. He was answering Hobbesian questions, using Hobbesian methods, just reaching different conclusions. And those different conclusions flowed from different premises about the state of nature and about what humans are like without government. If you accept Hobbes's vision of the state of nature as war, his absolutist conclusions become harder to avoid. If you accept Locke's gentler vision of the state of nature as imperfect but not unbearable, his liberal conclusions follow more naturally. Who was right about human nature? That question has occupied political philosophers ever since. Are humans as dangerous to each other as Hobbes believed? Or are we capable of the kind of moral restraint and cooperation Locke described? The answer probably varies with circumstances. In conditions of extreme scarcity and insecurity, Hobbes's vision seems grimly accurate. In conditions of relative abundance and security, Locke's optimism seems more justified. Neither captured the whole truth, but together they mapped the space within which much later political thought would develop. The American founders wrestled with exactly this tension. Thomas Jefferson's famous phrase in the Declaration of Independence, "Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness," echoes Locke's trinity of life, liberty, and property. The idea that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed is pure social contract theory, developed by Hobbes and Locke. The right to revolution when government becomes destructive of these ends is Lockean. But the American Constitution also reflects Hobbesian concerns. The separation of powers that Locke endorsed is built into the structure,
but so is the creation of a strong central government powerful enough to maintain order. The Federalist Papers, written to support ratification of the Constitution, often sound Hobbesian themes about the dangers of faction and the need for effective authority. The founders were trying to balance Lockean liberty with Hobbesian security, and the American experiment can be seen as an attempt to synthesize these rival visions.
As you settle deeper into rest, consider how these old debates remain alive. When we argue about how much power government should have, whether authority should be centralized or divided, when we can legitimately resist or disobey laws, we're still working through questions Hobbes and Locke posed. Their specific answers may not satisfy us, but their questions endure because they're asking about permanent features of political life. How to balance order and liberty, security and freedom, common good and individual rights. Hobbes saw the danger of chaos and prioritized order above almost everything else. Locke saw the danger of tyranny and prioritized liberty and rights. Both dangers are real. Both concerns are legitimate. And no political system has perfectly solved the problem of achieving security without sacrificing too much freedom or protecting liberty without risking too much instability. We're still, in a sense, trying to navigate between Hobbes and Locke, trying to get enough of each without the excesses of either. The conversation they began continues, and that, perhaps more than any specific doctrine either taught, is their greatest legacy. Transforming political philosophy into a systematic inquiry into the foundations of legitimate authority, an inquiry that takes seriously both the necessity and the dangers of power. Throughout his life, Hobbes held a peculiar conviction. Philosophy could be made as certain as mathematics. If we could just define our terms precisely enough, reason carefully enough, follow arguments rigorously enough, we could achieve in moral and political philosophy the same kind of demonstrative certainty that mathematicians achieved in geometry. This belief shaped how Hobbes approached philosophy and led him into both brilliant insights and embarrassing failures. Hobbes first encountered Euclidean geometry in his 40s, relatively late in life for a scholar. The story goes that he was in a gentleman's library and saw a copy of Euclid's Elements lying open. His eye fell on a proposition, a theorem about triangles. At first, he couldn't believe it. He looked at the proof, which referred back to earlier propositions. He looked at those propositions and their proofs, which referred to still earlier ones. Eventually, he worked his way back to the definitions and axioms that began the whole system. And he was amazed. From a handful of simple definitions and self-evident principles, Euclid had constructed an entire edifice of geometric knowledge, each theorem following necessarily from what came before. There was no appeal to authority, no reliance on observation, just pure reason working out the implications of clear concepts. This was certainty, real knowledge, not the endless disputation of traditional philosophy that never seemed to settle anything. Hobbes became convinced that this method could be applied to philosophy. If you could define basic concepts clearly, if you could identify the fundamental principles of human nature and social interaction, then you could deduce how politics must work with the same certainty that geometry could deduce the properties of triangles. This is why Leviathan begins with meticulous definitions of sensation, imagination, memory, reason. Hobbes was trying to build a philosophical system the way Euclid built geometry, from clear foundations through careful deduction to necessary conclusions. In many ways, this approach was Hobbes's great strength, his systematic rigor, his insistence on precise definition, his habit of making assumptions explicit and following their logical consequences. All of this gave his political philosophy a clarity and force that most earlier political thought lacked. When you read Leviathan, you can see each step of the argument, understand how later conclusions depend on earlier premises, trace the logical structure that holds the whole system together.
But the geometric ideal also led Hobbes into his most famous failure. If philosophy could be like mathematics, if reasoning was really a kind of calculation, then perhaps he could contribute to mathematics itself. And so Hobbes, brilliant as he was in many domains, spent years of his later life working on a problem that had stumped mathematicians for centuries: squaring the circle. The problem is simple to state. Can you construct a square with the same area as a given circle using only compass and straight edge? Ancient mathematicians had tried and failed. The problem seemed simple but proved remarkably resistant to solution, and Hobbes became convinced he'd solved it. He published his solution. Mathematicians pointed out errors. Hobbes revised and republished. The errors were pointed out again, more sharply this time. Hobbes dug in his heels, insisting that professional mathematicians were biased against him, were being deliberately obtuse, were protecting their positions by rejecting correct solutions from outsiders. The controversy dragged on for years, becoming increasingly bitter and increasingly embarrassing for Hobbes. The tragedy was that Hobbes was simply wrong, and the mathematicians were right. He'd made basic errors that any competent geometer could spot. Worse, he was arguing about mathematics with people who understood it far better than he did, yet he couldn't admit his mistakes. The same man who could dissect political philosophy with brilliant clarity became obstinate and unreasonable when confronted with his mathematical errors. Why did this happen? Perhaps because Hobbes had invested so much in the idea.
That reasoning was calculation, that philosophy was geometric. If he couldn't even do basic geometry correctly, what did that say about his grand systematic philosophy? He couldn't afford to admit mathematical error without seeming to undermine his whole project. So he doubled down, defended his mistakes, alienated the mathematical community, and damaged his reputation in ways that his political writings alone never would have. Yet the failure in mathematics doesn't actually undermine Hobbes's political philosophy. The geometric ideal was a guiding metaphor, an aspiration, not a literal claim that politics is mathematics. What Hobbes really achieved was something different from and more valuable than geometric proof. He created a systematic framework for thinking about politics, one that made assumptions explicit, followed implications carefully, and offered testable claims about how humans behave and what forms of government can succeed. This systematic approach was revolutionary. Before Hobbes, political philosophy was largely a matter of citing ancient authorities, appealing to tradition, invoking divine will, or making ad hoc arguments about specific situations. Hobbes offered something new, a general theory of politics built from first principles about human nature. You might disagree with his premises or his conclusions, but you had to engage with the systematic structure of his thought. You couldn't just cite Aristotle or appeal to custom. You had to show where Hobbes's reasoning went wrong, which meant reasoning at the same level of generality and rigor. The mechanistic worldview that underlay Hobbes's approach was part of a larger scientific revolution transforming 17th century thought. Galileo, Descartes, and others were showing that nature could be understood through mathematics and mechanics, that complicated phenomena could be explained in terms of matter in motion following natural laws. Hobbes tried to extend this approach to human society to show that politics too could be understood scientifically. In this, he was ahead of his time. The idea that human behavior follows patterns that can be studied systematically, that society operates according to principles we can discover through careful analysis. This idea would eventually develop into social science. Hobbes didn't create sociology or political science in their modern forms, but he gestured toward them, showed that such disciplines were possible in principle. His claim that reasoning is computation is particularly interesting in light of modern cognitive science and artificial intelligence. When Hobbes suggested that thinking is just adding and subtracting concepts, his contemporaries found it reductive and absurd. But in our age of computers, when we've built machines that manipulate symbols according to rules and thereby achieve something that looks like reasoning, Hobbes's idea seems less strange. We still debate whether artificial intelligence really thinks or just simulates thinking. But the very fact that the question arises shows that Hobbes touched on something deep about the nature of cognition. As you drift toward sleep tonight, consider the beautiful ambition in Hobbes's geometric ideal, even if the ideal was never fully realized. He wanted certainty in a domain where certainty seems impossible. He wanted to find principles of politics as clear and compelling as the Pythagorean theorem. He wanted to lift political discourse out of partisan squabbling and into the realm of demonstrative knowledge where rational people would have to agree. He failed, of course. Politics remains contested, uncertain, irreducibly plural in ways that geometry is not. But the attempt itself was noble, and the systematic approach he pioneered became the standard for serious political philosophy. After Hobbes, you couldn't just assert political claims. You had to argue for them, systematically, from defensible premises through logical steps that others could examine. That expectation of rigor is part of his legacy. The stubborn old man trying to square the circle, refusing to admit his mathematical incompetence, cuts a somewhat comic figure. But the brilliant philosopher who transformed how we think about political authority, who forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and power, who built a system of thought so comprehensive and rigorous that we're still working through its implications, that figure commands respect. The geometric ideal inspired the achievement even if the achievement didn't live up to the ideal. Rest now in the knowledge that human understanding has limits, that our grandest ambitions often exceed our reach, but that even failed aspirations can produce valuable insights along the way. Hobbes wanted more certainty than politics allows, but in seeking it, he gave us concepts and arguments that clarified political thought for generations to come. More than 300 years have passed since Hobbes died, yet his shadow falls across contemporary politics in ways both obvious and subtle. Open any newspaper, scroll through any news feed, and you'll find Hobbesian questions lurking beneath the surface of current debates. How much power should government have? When does security justify limiting liberty? What legitimates political authority? Can international order exist without world government? These are Hobbes's questions, even when we don't recognize them as such. The 20th century saw a remarkable revival of social contract theory in academic philosophy. For much of the 19th century, Hobbes and social contract thinking had been eclipsed by other approaches to politics, by utilitarianism, by Hegelian idealism, by Marxist historical materialism, by conservative appeals to organic tradition. But in 1971, John Rawls published A Theory of Justice, and suddenly social contract theory was at the center of political philosophy again. Rawls's approach was explicitly Hobbesian in structure, even while reaching conclusions Hobbes would never have endorsed. Rawls asked readers to imagine people in an original position, choosing principles of justice behind a veil of ignorance that prevented them from knowing their own position in society. This was a thought experiment directly descended from Hobbes's state of nature, a way of using hypothetical reasoning to discover what rational agreement could establish about legitimate political arrangements. Rawls concluded that people in the original position would choose principles guaranteeing equal basic liberties and allowing inequalities only when they benefit the worst off.
These liberal egalitarian conclusions are far from Hobbes's absolutism, but the method is recognizably Hobbesian. We're still using variations on the social contract framework to argue about justice, still imagining what rational people would agree to under certain conditions, still deriving political principles from hypothetical consent. Game theory, developed in the mid-20th century to analyze strategic interaction, gave Hobbes's insights mathematical precision. The prisoner's dilemma, perhaps the most famous concept in game theory, is essentially the Hobbesian problem in formal terms. Two prisoners are separately offered deals. If both stay silent, both get light sentences. If one betrays the other while the other stays silent, the betrayer goes free while the silent one gets a harsh sentence. If both betray, both get moderate sentences. The rational choice for each prisoner, considered individually, is to betray, because betrayal yields a better outcome regardless of what the other prisoner does. But if both reason this way, both end up worse off than if they'd both stayed silent. This is exactly Hobbes's covenant problem. Individual rationality undermines collective good unless there's an enforcement mechanism that changes the incentive structure. Game. Theorists have used this framework to analyze everything from nuclear deterrence to environmental policy to the evolution of cooperation. And in doing so, they're working through Hobbesian logic, showing how the structure of strategic interaction creates problems that individual rationality alone cannot solve. Hobbes didn't have the mathematical tools of modern game theory, but he grasped the essential logic 3 centuries earlier. Contemporary debates about security and liberty constantly replay Hobbesian themes. After terrorist attacks, governments claim emergency powers, expand surveillance, limit civil liberties, all in the name of protecting citizens. Critics respond that security purchased at the cost of freedom isn't worth having, that we're betraying our values by the very measures meant to protect them. But notice that both sides accept the Hobbesian framing. Security and liberty are being traded against each other, and the question is where to strike the balance. The COVID-19 pandemic brought Hobbesian questions into sharp relief. Governments imposed lockdowns, restricted movement, mandated vaccines or masks, closed businesses. Some people accepted these measures as necessary to protect public health, as the kind of collective action problem that only government authority could solve. Others resisted as violations of liberty, as government overreach, as tyranny disguised as public health policy. The debate divided along lines that would have been familiar to Hobbes. How much authority should government have in emergencies? When does protecting life justify restricting liberty? In international relations, Hobbes's vision of the state of nature describes relations among sovereign states better than it ever described relations among individuals. There is no world government, no authority above nations that can enforce international law. Countries exist in something like a state of nature with respect to each other, each pursuing its own interests, each potentially in conflict with others, each relying ultimately on its own power to secure its position. This produces what political scientists call the security dilemma at the international level. When one country builds up its military for defensive purposes, neighboring countries perceive a threat and build up their own militaries in response, which makes the first country feel less secure, so it builds up even more, and the cycle continues. Everyone acts defensively. Everyone becomes less secure.
It's Hobbes's dynamic of diffidence playing out among nations. Realism in international relations theory is explicitly Hobbesian. Realists argue that moral considerations matter little in relations among states, that power and security are what drive international politics, that cooperation is always fragile because there's no enforcement mechanism that can reliably constrain sovereign states. They don't necessarily endorse this situation, but they claim to describe how international politics
Actually works, given the anarchic structure of the international system. Technology has created new forms of power that Hobbes never imagined, but that raise thoroughly Hobbesian questions. Surveillance states can monitor citizens with unprecedented thoroughness, tracking movements, reading communications, predicting behavior. Governments justify this surveillance with Hobbesian logic. We need these powers to protect you from terrorism, from crime, from disorder. But the result is a kind of Leviathan that can see everything, know everything about its subjects in ways that would have seemed like godlike power in Hobbes's time. Corporate power raises similar issues. Large technology companies control platforms that shape political discourse, influence elections, determine what information billions of people see. They're not governments in the traditional sense, but they exercise forms of power that look increasingly sovereign. Do we need a Leviathan to control these corporate Leviathans? Or are we creating new forms of authority that don't fit Hobbes's categories? Climate change presents perhaps the most purely Hobbesian problem of our era. Every nation benefits if all nations reduce emissions, but each nation has an incentive to let others bear the cost of reduction while continuing to emit itself. This is a global collective action problem, a tragedy of the commons on a planetary scale. The Hobbesian solution would be world government powerful enough to enforce emissions limits. But creating such government seems impossible, so we're stuck trying to solve a Hobbesian problem without Hobbesian solutions. The rise of authoritarian leaders around the world often comes wrapped in Hobbesian rhetoric. Strongmen promise order, security, protection from chaos. They ask citizens to accept concentrated power in exchange for stability. They justify limiting dissent, suppressing opposition, consolidating authority by pointing to threats, real or imagined. The implicit bargain is Hobbesian. Give me absolute power and I'll protect you. Whether citizens are actually safer under such arrangements is questionable, but the rhetorical appeal remains powerful. Yet Hobbes also helps us critique authoritarianism. Remember that Hobbes's sovereign gains authority through consent of the governed, through the rational agreement of equals who create common power for their mutual benefit. A leader who seizes power through force hasn't created legitimate sovereignty in Hobbesian terms. And even legitimate sovereignty exists to protect subjects' lives. When government becomes the main threat to life rather than the protector of life, Hobbes's own logic suggests subjects can resist. Feminist philosophers have offered important critiques of social contract theory that expose blind spots in Hobbes and the tradition he founded. Carol Paterman argued that beneath the social contract is a prior sexual contract that establishes male dominance over women, the supposedly universal.
Agreement among equals turns out to have excluded half of humanity. Women weren't party to the original contract, but were subjects of it, subordinated by the very agreement that supposedly created political equality. Critical race theorists have made similar arguments. Charles Mills wrote of a racial contract that established white supremacy while claiming to establish equality.
When Hobbes and Locke wrote about the state of nature and social contract, they were theorizing about relations among white European men. Indigenous peoples, enslaved Africans, colonized populations were outside the framework entirely, subject to domination, that the contract did nothing to legitimate, but also nothing to prevent. These critiques don't simply reject social contract theory, but force us to confront who was included and excluded in the original formulations. They show that supposedly universal theories of politics were partial, limited to certain groups, while claiming universal applicability. The questions Hobbes raised about political legitimacy and consent remain important, but we have to ask them more inclusively, recognizing that the answers may be different when we include everyone, rather than just some. As you rest tonight, consider how thoroughly Hobbesian our political vocabulary remains. We talk about social contracts, about legitimacy based on consent, about the balance between security and freedom, about the enforcement of agreements, about collective action problems. These concepts and frameworks come down to us from Hobbes, refined and modified, but recognizably his intellectual offspring. We may reject his authoritarian conclusions. We may have more optimistic views of human nature. We may aspire to forms of politics he never imagined. But we're still working within and against the structure of thought he created, still grappling with the problems he identified, still trying to answer the fundamental question he posed with such clarity. How can beings like us live together without destroying each other? The relevance of a 17th century philosopher to 21st century politics tells us something important. The problems Hobbes addressed aren't artifacts of his time, but permanent features of political life. As long as humans have conflicting interests, limited resources, and the ability to harm each other, we'll need some answer to the Hobbesian question of how to maintain order. Our answers may differ from his, but we can't escape the question itself. At the heart of Hobbes's political philosophy lies an emotion he understood better than most philosophers before or since: fear. Not fear as a personal weakness or irrational response, but fear as a fundamental driver of political life, as the emotion that both creates the problem of order and provides resources for solving it. Remember that Hobbes was born prematurely as the Spanish Armada approached, born of his mother's terror. "Fear and I were born twins together," he wrote. This wasn't just biographical colour, but philosophical insight. Fear was Hobbes's constant companion, the emotion that shaped his understanding of human motivation and political necessity. In the state of nature, fear reigns supreme. The fear of violent death drives everything else. People seek power not primarily because they're greedy or ambitious, but because they're afraid of what will happen if they're powerless. They strike first, not because they're aggressive, but because they fear being struck. They accumulate resources not because they're miserly, but because they fear future scarcity. Fear is the great motivator in Hobbes's psychology, the passion that explains why rational beings would create such a dangerous situation for themselves. But fear is also what makes escape possible. The same fear that drives conflict in the state of nature also drives people to seek peace. The fear of violent death makes people willing to accept almost any alternative, including submission to sovereign power. Fear of punishment makes people keep covenants they might otherwise break. Fear of chaos makes people tolerate governments they might otherwise resist. This dual role of fear is central to understanding
isn't just a problem to be solved, but a resource to be used. The sovereign must inspire awe, must be feared, must be powerful enough that fear of punishment outweighs temptation to break laws. A sovereign that isn't feared isn't really sovereign, because subjects will calculate that they can violate laws with impunity. Power without the capacity to inspire fear is impotent. Yet Hobbes was also aware of the dangers of fear. A government that rules only through terror, that makes subjects fear it more than they fear returning to the state of nature, undermines its own legitimacy. Remember that in Hobbes's theory, subjects retain the right of self-preservation. If the sovereign becomes the primary threat to subjects' lives rather than their protector, subjects can legitimately resist. Fear of government can be as destructive as fear in the state of nature. This suggests a delicate balance. The sovereign must be feared enough to maintain order, but not so feared that subjects see it as a threat rather than a protector. It must inspire awe, the mixture of fear and respect that makes obedience seem both prudent and appropriate. Too little fear and laws aren't enforced. Too much fear and government becomes tyranny that subjects have reason to resist. Modern psychology has confirmed much of what Hobbes intuitively grasped about fear's role in social life. We know that fear is one of the most powerful motivators of human behavior, that threatened people seek security even at the cost of freedom, that fear can override other concerns and narrow our focus to immediate self-preservation. We also know that fear can be manipulated, that authorities can use threat exaggeration to gain power, that the politics of fear can undermine the very freedoms it claims to
Protect. Consider how often governments invoke fear to justify their actions. After the September 11th attacks, the US government launched a war on terror that led to expanded surveillance, military interventions, detention without trial, and torture. Much of this was justified by the claim that extraordinary threats require extraordinary powers. Fear of terrorism made citizens willing to accept measures they would have rejected in calmer times. Was this Hobbesian sovereignty in action? Government doing what's necessary to protect subjects from violent death? Or was it manipulation of fear to accumulate power beyond what's actually needed for security? Hobbes would say that depends on whether the measures genuinely served the purpose of protection or whether they served other interests under cover of necessity. But he'd also recognize that making this judgment is difficult, that subjects aren't always in a position to know what's genuinely necessary, and that government has both motive and opportunity to exaggerate threats. The politics of fear isn't unique to our time. Hobbes lived through an era when religious fear was used to justify persecution, when fear of heresy and witchcraft led to torture and execution, when fear of political disorder was invoked to suppress dissent. He recognized that fear could be instrumentalized, used by those in power to maintain control. Yet he also believed that some fear was appropriate, that recognizing our vulnerability and the dangers around us was rational rather than paranoid. This raises profound questions about how we should respond to fear in political life. Should we resist fear, refuse to let it guide our decisions, insist on maintaining liberty even when threatened? That's one response, the one that says, those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither. It's a noble sentiment, but Hobbes would ask whether it's realistic.
Can people really maintain their commitment to liberty when they're genuinely terrified? And if fear does drive political decisions, shouldn't we think carefully about how to channel it productively rather than simply declaring it inadmissible? Or should we accept fear as a legitimate factor in political reasoning, acknowledge that security is a genuine good that sometimes requires limiting freedom? That's closer to Hobbes's position, but it opens the door to the very manipulation he worried about. Once we accept that fear justifies expanded power, authorities have strong incentives to keep us afraid, to magnify threats, to ensure that the emergency never quite ends. Perhaps the wisest response is neither to reject fear entirely, nor to let it dominate, but to think carefully about what we're afraid of and whether proposed responses genuinely address those fears. Hobbes would approve of this approach. He valued reason precisely because it could discipline passion, including fear. The fear that drives us to seek security should be
guided by rational calculation about what genuinely serves self-preservation, not by panic or manipulation. One of Hobbes's most interesting observations about fear concerns its relationship to freedom. He defined liberty as absence of external impediments to motion. When you're free to do something, nothing external is preventing you from doing it. But notice that this definition is compatible with being motivated by fear. If you obey the law because you fear punishment, you're still acting freely in Hobbes's sense because the law doesn't physically prevent your action. It just gives you a reason not to act. This might seem like a verbal trick, but there's something important here. For Hobbes, the opposite of freedom isn't being influenced by fear, but being physically constrained or unable to act. And this suggests that a society where people obey laws out of fear of punishment can still be a free society, as long as the laws leave people space to make their own choices about how to live within legal constraints. He makes this point explicitly when talking about liberty under sovereignty. He says that liberty depends on the silence of the laws. Where the law doesn't speak, you're free to act as you choose. The sovereign needn't regulate everything, needn't control every aspect of life. There can be wide areas of liberty even under absolute sovereignty, as long as the sovereign chooses not to fill those spaces with commands. This is a thin conception of freedom by many standards, but it has a certain realism. Perfect freedom from all influence, from all pressure, from all consequences of our choices is impossible. We are always constrained by circumstances, influenced by consequences, responding to incentives and disincentives. The question isn't whether we're influenced, but whether we retain choice within the structure of influences that shape our decisions. As you drift deeper into rest, reflect on the role fear plays in your own life. The locks on your doors, the passwords on your accounts, the insurance policies you maintain, all reflect reasonable fear of potential harms. You take precautions not because you're paranoid, but because you're realistically aware of risks. This is Hobbesian fear at work, the rational recognition of vulnerability that leads to protective measures. But also notice that you're able to rest precisely because those protective measures work. The government maintains order, police deter crime, social norms constrain most people's behavior most of the time. You can be vulnerable in sleep because you trust, usually without thinking about it, that the structures of order will hold through the night. Fear has been channeled into institutions that make security possible, which in turn makes the vulnerability of rest possible. Hobbes understood this paradox. We need fear to motivate the creation of order, but successful order lets us mostly forget our fear.
A well-functioning Leviathan fades into the background. Its
Power so reliable that we rarely think about the violence it prevents or the chaos it holds at bay. Only when order breaks down, when we get glimpses of the state of nature that always lurks beneath civilization's surface, do we remember why we need the Leviathan at all. Thomas Hobbes lived to the remarkable age of 91, surviving well into the Restoration period that followed Cromwell's Commonwealth. The final 2 decades of his life were lived under the protection and constraint we've already mentioned. Charles II granted him a pension and forbade him to publish on politics or religion. The Monster of Malmesbury was neutralized, kept as a kind of intellectual pet at court, but prevented from further stirring up controversy. These years must have been frustrating for a mind as active and combative as Hobbes's. He had more to say, more arguments to make, more responses to critics who had attacked Leviathan and his earlier works. But silence had been imposed as the price of safety. So Hobbes turned his energies elsewhere, to pursuits that wouldn't directly challenge church or state. He continued his mathematical work, despite, or perhaps because of his earlier humiliations over circle squaring. The man who had been so brilliant in political philosophy showed remarkable stubbornness in mathematics, continuing to publish claims that professional mathematicians could easily refute. These late mathematical works added nothing to his reputation and provided ammunition for critics who wanted to dismiss his entire philosophical system. Yet Hobbes persisted, convinced that the mathematicians were wrong even when they could demonstrate his errors step by step. There's something both admirable and sad about this stubbornness. Admirable because Hobbes refused to simply accept authority, maintained intellectual independence even when it made him look foolish. Sad because he was wasting his brilliance on a field where he lacked the necessary rigor, defending errors that a more humble person would have acknowledged. The same quality that made him willing to challenge centuries of political philosophy, the same intellectual courage that let him publish Leviathan, despite knowing it would make enemies, became a liability when directed at mathematics. He did write one more major political work, though it couldn't be published during his lifetime. Behemoth, or The Long Parliament, was Hobbes's history of the English Civil War, applying his political philosophy to recent events. The book examined how religious enthusiasm, constitutional disputes, and competing authorities had combined to destroy civil peace. It was, in effect, a sustained argument that everything Leviathan had warned against had happened in England, proving the necessity of the absolute sovereignty Hobbes had defended. Charles II read Behemoth in manuscript and forbade its publication. Even a historical analysis of the Civil War was too controversial, too likely to reopen wounds that the Restoration was trying to heal. The book circulated in manuscript among scholars and was only published after Hobbes's death, when it could no longer cause immediate political problems. Hobbes also produced translations in his final years, rendering Homer's Iliad and Odyssey into English verse. This was work he'd loved as a young scholar, returning to the classics that had first inspired his intellectual life. The translations were competent but not brilliant, the work of an old man staying active rather than breaking new ground. But they gave Hobbes satisfaction and kept his mind engaged when he could no longer pursue philosophy directly. In 1675, at age 87, Hobbes left London for the last time. He moved to the countryside, to estates owned by his longtime patrons, the Cavendish family. He'd served them for most of his adult life, first as tutor to William Cavendish, then in various capacities to different branches of the family. Now, in his final years, they provided him refuge and support. He spent his last years at Hardwicke Hall in Derbyshire, living quietly, writing occasionally, receiving visitors who wanted to meet the famous philosopher. He composed an autobiography in Latin verse, looking back over his long life and the turbulent century he'd witnessed. Born under the shadow of the Spanish Armada, living through civil war and revolution, surviving into the Restoration, he'd seen England transform repeatedly, seen his philosophical landscape shift from scholasticism to early modern rationalism. In December 1679, Hobbes suffered a stroke. He became paralyzed and died within days. He was buried in the churchyard at St. John the Baptist Church in Alt Hucknall, a quiet country church far from the controversies and disputes that had marked his intellectual life. His grave was simple, marked with a Latin inscription that identified him as Thomas Hobbes of Malmesbury and noted his philosophical reputation. His death was little noted beyond the circles of scholars and former associates. He'd been controversial enough that many were relieved to see him go. His books remained on lists of prohibited works. Universities warned students against Hobbesism as dangerous to morality and religion. For decades after his death, Hobbesian was a term of abuse, suggesting atheism, materialism, moral corruption. Yet his ideas survived suppression and slowly transformed how people thought about politics. The social contract framework became standard in political philosophy, even among those who rejected Hobbes's absolutist conclusions. The questions he'd posed about political legitimacy, about the relationship between security and liberty, about the foundations of political obligation, these couldn't be unasked, and the clarity with which he'd posed them set the agenda for political philosophy in ways that outlasted the controversies over his specific doctrines. John Locke built on Hobbesian foundations to reach liberal conclusions. Rousseau transformed the social contract into a theory of popular sovereignty. Kant developed social contract ideas into sophisticated moral and political philosophy. The American and French revolutions were fought with concepts and arguments that Hobbes had helped create, even though the revolutionaries would have rejected his monarchism. The very idea that government requires consent of the governed, that political authority needs rational justification, that we should think about politics in terms of what rational people would agree to, all of this bears Hobbes's influence. In the 19th century, as political philosophy moved away from social contract theory temporarily, Hobbes was remembered mostly as a historical figure, important but superseded. But the 20th century brought renewed appreciation for his systematic approach and his unflinching realism about power and conflict. After 2 world wars and countless revolutions, after witnessing how quickly civilization could collapse into barbarism, Hobbes's dark vision of human nature seemed less like pessimistic exaggeration and more like cold-eyed truth. Contemporary political philosophers might reject Hobbes's absolutism, but they recognize his genius in framing questions. When we argue about justice, about rights, about legitimate authority, we're working within intellectual space that Hobbes helped create. He made political philosophy systematic, rigorous, focused on fundamental questions rather than surface disputes. That methodological achievement matters as much as any specific doctrine he taught. As you rest tonight, imagine Hobbes in his final years at Hardwicke Hall, an old man looking back over 9 decades of life. He'd been present at the birth of modern political philosophy. He'd witnessed the collapse of the old certainties about authority and tradition. He'd tried to build new foundations,
to show how rational beings could create order without appealing to divine right or ancient custom. He'd made enemies, been condemned and banned and burned in effigy, and he'd survived it all, outliving most critics, seeing his ideas spread despite opposition. There's a certain peace in that image. The fierce controversialist made quiet in age. The bold, systematic thinker returned to classical translation. The man who'd tried to reduce human nature to geometry, finally accepting the limits of his ambitions. He'd done what he set out to do, changed how we think about politics. Whether people accepted his conclusions mattered less than that they had to engage with his arguments. The Leviathan he'd described lived on in the institutions and concepts that structured political life. And the book called Leviathan lived on to be read, argued with, and built upon by generation after generation. As we near the end of our journey through Hobbes's thought, it's worth stepping back to ask what he ultimately teaches us. Not whether his specific conclusions are correct, not whether we should accept absolute
sovereignty or reject it, but what we learn about ourselves and political life from engaging seriously with his arguments. First, Hobbes teaches us to look unflinchingly at the foundations of social order. We live in societies held together by laws and institutions that we largely take for granted. Most of the time, we don't think about why people obey laws or what prevents society from dissolving into chaos. Hobbes forces us to think about these foundations, to recognize that social order is an achievement rather than a given, something that must be continually maintained rather than something we can simply assume. This doesn't mean accepting Hobbes's dark view of the state of nature or his authoritarian conclusions, but it does mean recognizing that cooperation among self-interested individuals isn't automatic or natural. It requires structures, incentives, enforcement mechanisms. The peace we enjoy is fragile, dependent on institutions that channel human behavior in productive rather than destructive directions. Second, Hobbes teaches us about the relationship between structure and agency in shaping human behavior. He's often accused of having a dim view of human nature, of thinking people are inherently selfish or vicious. But that misreads him. Hobbes's point is more subtle. The situation people find themselves in shapes how they act more than their individual character does. In the state of nature, even virtuous people have reason to act in ways that undermine cooperation, because the structure of interaction makes trust impossible and defensive violence rational. In civil society, even selfish people can cooperate productively because the structure of incentives makes cooperation rational and defection costly. Change the situation and you change behavior without requiring people to become morally better or worse than they are. This is a profoundly important insight for thinking about social problems. It suggests that we should focus less on trying to make people more virtuous and more on creating structures that make virtuous behavior rational. We can't eliminate human selfishness, but we can channel it in ways that serve common good. We can't guarantee that everyone will keep promises, but we can create enforcement mechanisms that make promise breaking costly enough that most people keep their word most of the time. Third, Hobbes teaches us to think clearly about the distinction between what we'd like to be true and what actually is true. He was willing to follow arguments wherever they led, even when the conclusions were uncomfortable. He didn't let wishful thinking about human nature, or appeals to what would be nice cloud his analysis of what human beings are actually like and how they actually behave. This kind of realism is rare and valuable. Most of us prefer comforting illusions to harsh truths. We like to think that people are basically good, that cooperation comes naturally, that we could get along fine without coercive authority, if only we tried harder. Hobbes asks whether these beliefs can withstand scrutiny, whether they accurately describe how people behave when structures of authority break down. Fourth, Hobbes teaches us about the necessity of power. Many strands of political thought try to imagine politics without power, or at least try to minimize power's role. Anarchist traditions dream of societies with no coercive authority. Liberal traditions try to constrain and limit power. But Hobbes insists that power is necessary, that without it we cannot have rights or justice or any of the things we value about civilized life. This doesn't mean celebrating power or accepting its abuse. It means recognizing that rights without enforcement are just words, that agreements without sanctions are unreliable, that order requires authority. The question isn't whether to have power, but how to structure it, how to ensure it serves the purposes for which it exists, rather than becoming an end in itself. Fifth, Hobbes teaches us to think about legitimacy in terms of purpose and consent rather than tradition or divine right. Government isn't legitimate because it's ancient or because God appointed rulers. It's legitimate to the extent that it serves the purpose for which rational people would create government, protecting life, securing peace, enabling cooperation. This is a revolutionary idea, even if we've become so used to it that we don't recognize its radicalism. It makes all political authority conditional, subject to justification in terms of human purposes. It denies that anyone has a natural right to rule others. It insists that political power requires justification that those subject to it can understand and accept. Sixth, Hobbes teaches us about the permanent tension between security and liberty. We want both, but they can conflict. More security often means more constraint, more surveillance, more power given to authorities. More liberty means less security, more risk, more uncertainty about how others will behave. This tension can't be perfectly resolved, only navigated with constant attention to how much of each we're getting and whether the balance is right. Different people will strike this balance differently, depending on their circumstances and values. Those who've lived through chaos will prioritize order. Those who've lived under tyranny will prioritize freedom. Hobbes reminds us that both are real goods, that neither can be fully sacrificed without terrible cost, and that we're always trading them against each other, whether we acknowledge it or not. Finally, Hobbes teaches us about the role of reason in human life. He believed passionately that reason could guide us toward peace, could show us how to escape the trap of the state of nature, could establish principles of political life on firm foundations. He had perhaps too much faith in reason's power, certainly too much confidence in his own reasoning abilities. But the faith itself is admirable. We live in an age of deep polarization where political disputes seem increasingly driven by passion rather than argument, where people retreat into echo chambers that reinforce their prejudices rather than challenging them. Hobbes would despair at this. He believed that rational people, thinking clearly about their situation and interests, could reach agreement on fundamental political principles even if they disagreed about many specifics. Was he right? Can reason bridge our political divides? Can careful argument convince people to change their minds about fundamental questions? The answers aren't obvious. But Hobbes's faith that the attempt is worthwhile remains inspiring. If we give up on reason's ability to resolve disputes, if we accept that politics is just a clash of wills with no hope of rational resolution, then we're left with nothing but power against power, which is just the state of nature by another name. As you settle into the final stages of rest, consider what it means to live in a civilization shaped by Hobbesian questions and insights. The social contract isn't just a philosophical concept, but describes something real about how we live together. We have collectively created structures of authority that make cooperation possible, that protect rights, that enable us to plan for the future without constant fear. These structures are imperfect. They sometimes fail. They can be abused. They don't solve every problem or prevent every injustice. But they're better than the alternative, better than the state of nature that would emerge if they collapsed. And recognizing their necessity, understanding why we need them even when they constrain us, is part of what it means to be politically mature. Hobbes doesn't give us easy answers or comfortable reassurances. He confronts us with difficult truths about power, about human nature, about the price of peace. But in doing so, he helps us think more clearly about the political world we actually inhabit, rather than the one we wish existed. And that clarity, uncomfortable as it sometimes is a gift that continues to illuminate 3.5 centuries after he first offered it. We've travelled a long way tonight, from the premature birth during the Spanish Armada to the quiet death in a Derbyshire churchyard. We followed Thomas Hobbes through civil war and exile, through mathematical embarrassments and philosophical triumphs, through the creation of a book that would transform political thought. And we've grappled with the ideas that made him both famous and infamous. The state of nature as war of all against all, the social contract as escape from chaos, the Leviathan as necessary monster we create to save ourselves. What are we to make of this strange, brilliant, difficult man and his unsettling philosophy? The easy response is to reject him, to insist that people are better than he believed, that we don't need absolute sovereignty, that his cure is worse than the disease, and there's
Truth in these objections. Hobbes did underestimate human capacity for cooperation. He did overestimate the necessity of absolute power. His political philosophy, if implemented literally, would produce tyranny. But easy rejection misses what's valuable in Hobbes. He forced us to confront questions we'd rather avoid. Why should I obey? What makes political authority legitimate? How do we create order among beings capable of harming each other? What's the alternative to government? These questions don't have comfortable answers, but they're important questions, perhaps the most important questions in political philosophy. The enduring value of Hobbes lies not in his specific answers, but in how he transformed political thinking. Before Hobbes, political philosophy was largely about interpreting traditions, citing authorities, applying religious principles to governance. After Hobbes, political philosophy became systematic inquiry into foundations, rigorous argument from first principles, careful analysis of concepts like sovereignty, rights, obligation, justice. He made us think about politics scientifically, not in the sense of using mathematics or experiments, but in the sense of seeking general theories that could explain and predict. He showed that political philosophy could be as rigorous as any other intellectual discipline, that questions about how we should live together could be approached with the same systematic care that mathematicians bring to geometry or physicists bring to motion.
The irony we noted earlier remains striking. Hobbes seemed to defend absolute monarchy, yet he undermined traditional monarchism. He appeared authoritarian, yet he planted seeds of democracy. He argued for unconditional obedience, yet he based it on consent. These tensions aren't contradictions, but mark the transitional nature of his thought. He was working out implications of modern ideas about equality and consent and rational justification, even though those implications would eventually lead away from his monarchist conclusions. Later thinkers like Locke and Rousseau could reach liberal and democratic conclusions precisely because Hobbes had established the framework. Once you accept that political authority requires consent of the governed, that it must be justified in terms of human purposes, that no one has natural right to rule others, you've accepted premises that point toward democracy even if you don't follow them all the way there. Hobbes opened doors he didn't intend to walk through, created possibilities he didn't fully recognize. The warning Hobbes offers remains relevant. Civilization is fragile. Order is not guaranteed. The peace and security we enjoy depend on institutions and practices that must be maintained. When we take these things for granted, when we assume that cooperation will continue without attention to the structures that make it possible, we risk sliding back towards something resembling the state of nature. This
Doesn't mean accepting authoritarianism. It means taking seriously the work of maintaining democratic institutions, of building trust, of creating and enforcing rules that enable cooperation. It means recognizing that liberty requires structure, that rights require enforcement, that the absence of authority isn't freedom, but chaos. But Hobbes also offers comfort, though perhaps not the kind most philosophers offer. He shows us that despite our flaws, despite our selfishness and fear and propensity for conflict, we're capable of creating order. We can use reason to escape traps that passion creates. We can build institutions that channel self-interest toward common good. We can live together peacefully, despite being dangerous to each other, can create civilization despite our limitations. This is a modest hope, but a real one. We don't need to become angels to live together well. We just need to be smart enough to create structures that make cooperation rational and maintain them with enough vigilance that they don't decay. That's achievable. Difficult, requiring constant attention, never perfectly successful, but achievable. And achieving it is the work of politics, the great collective enterprise of building and maintaining the Leviathan that protects us from each other and ourselves. Tonight, as you finally release yourself into sleep, consider where you are and how you got here. You lie in a bed in a home that's yours under law. You're protected by walls and locks that work because most people respect property rights most of the time. You're surrounded by a society that functions because people generally follow rules, keep agreements, refrain from violence. Tomorrow you'll wake and go about your business in a world where cooperation is normal, where strangers can interact without constant fear, where long-term projects are possible because we can trust that basic order will persist. All of this, Hobbes would say, depends on the Leviathan, not necessarily a king or dictator, but common power that enforces law and maintains peace. The specific form matters less than the function, creating conditions where human beings can live together without constant fear of returning to the state of nature. This common power exists in the background of your life, so reliable that you barely notice it, making possible the security in which you rest. The doors are locked,
The laws are enforced. The social contract holds. The Leviathan watches through the night. That artificial monster we've created from our mutual agreement. That great power we've authorized to protect us from dangers we pose to each other. It's not perfect. It sometimes fails. It can be abused. But it's better than the alternative. Better than the solitary, poor, nasty, brutish and short life that Hobbes described awaiting us without it. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the thought of Thomas Hobbes, the Monster of Malmesbury, the philosopher who dared to look at human nature
without flinching, and who tried to build a science of politics on the foundations of fear and reason. If you found value in these explorations, please like and subscribe. Your support helps these conversations reach others who seek understanding in quiet moments. Sleep well tonight, protected by institutions and agreements, resting in the peace that countless generations have worked to maintain, secure in the knowledge that the Leviathan keeps its vigil while you dream. The social contract that Hobbes described isn't just philosophical theory, but describes something real about how we live. And in that reality, in the order we've collectively created and maintained, you can safely surrender to rest. The monster watches, the covenant holds, peace prevails, and you, dear listener, can sleep.